So I got an ask from Friendliest Human, and it was, "Hi Clock, how do you make a plushie? Did you learn somewhere or just winging it? I wanted to learn for a long time, but I'm too afraid to mess it up to do it. Are you willing to share some tips? No pressure, just very curious with a lot of free time." And I know a lot of you do have a lot of free time right now, for better or worse, and are looking for things to do or maybe experiment with something that you've been wanting to play around with. And I decided that I'd go ahead and do a quick little video talking about this some. I'm doing a video instead of typing it. One, because typing a tutorial with pictures takes a lot longer. And two, my hands are really sore from doing all of this typing to make sure that my students can understand everything and have the best learning environment possible, despite the fact that we're not in the classroom anymore. So this is actually easier for me to do. I do apologize for the mess of a setup. This is something just thrown together quickly to try to show things off. Thankfully for my students, I'm recording my computer screen instead of something like this. But welcome to my very messy workstation. So yes, I'm willing to talk about this and share some of the things I do. First and foremost, though, is a major disclaimer. I don't consider myself a plushie maker. I consider myself a sculptor who sometimes works with fabric, and I'm not saying this in an egotistical way, like, oh my god, sculpture is better than plushie makers. I'm saying this because of the amazing things I see plushie makers doing, and I am not at their caliber at all. I'm primarily a clay worker who's applying my knowledge to a different medium type. Um, and in that, I'm winging it. 99% of the time when I'm doing anything art related, I'm winging it. And this is for a few reasons. Some, it's my natural enjoyment of creating. I love just having an idea and trying things until it works. I love the problem solving of creating. And the other part of it is a little bit to protect myself. I can get into research paralysis really quickly, and I can be an absolutely huge perfectionist. Perfectionism is something I'm still constantly trying to fight against. And especially because I see other people's products and they don't worry about the same things I worry about. And it's not to say that their work isn't of any level of quality, it's still really high quality, but I see them letting themselves go on some of the things that I get held up on that can completely stop projects sometimes. And this is why you actually see me tend to get projects to about the 80 or 90% stage where things start getting really detailed or serious, or I need to put in the perfection, and I tend to take that to the extreme and then never finish because I'm worried about it not being good enough. I get in my own way within my ideas of perfectionism, sometimes unrealistically so. So it's best for me if I don't do a lot of research first and just jump into it and start problem solving. That what works for me personally. That said, if you don't want to do that, the best way to get something started with something like plushie making is to buy a pattern off of something like Etsy. You can print it at home and try it out with fabrics you have and learn to see how to make plushies from how they make plushies and things like that. So if you're worried about what to go through and how to start, that can be a really good way because you know that they've already made the pattern, they've already made sure it looks good. If they have good reviews, they know it can go out to other people and be understood and still come together. So that's a really valid way to think about doing this. But if you do want to MacGyver things together, you can certainly go at it my way, and I'll show you a little bit of how I do that. First and foremost, a little bit of my background. I have a bachelor's of science in architecture, kind of. My first 2 years were in architecture. My second 2 years were in visualization sciences, computer animation, because the degree didn't fully exist till after I graduated. And my favorite thing to do in computer animation was texturing, which was taking apart a 3D surface and laying out flat so you could paint on it. So, in a way, I'd already been doing some things within this process because that's what texturing is. And when you're doing architecture, it's all about looking at 3D forms and breaking them down into 2D, or taking 2D forms and making them into 3D. So I do have a little bit of a background in this. I also was brought up to know some basic sewing skills. Sewing on a button, sewing in a patch. I was the dedicated repairer of our family's dog's favorite teddy bear growing up. So I do know some basic sewing skills. And if you don't know any basic sewing skills, I would learn some very basic stitches. And a good thing to always do with sewing is whenever you're doing material, just Google best stitch for X, best stitch for cotton or linen or felt or minky, because you might use a very different stitch for minky or felt than you might use for a cotton or a linen. But that said, this was all brought up because of good old Plague Bird. What is my process working through this? And how do I get there? The main thing, if you're going to start trying to draft plushies, is to think about knowing a few basic shapes. Let me actually grab a Sharpie and do some scribbling, if I can get this somewhere that you guys can see it on screen. Okay, so if you think about it, there's a few basic shapes who make up everything. And a really good shape to know is a cylinder. A cylinder is an arm or a leg or something like that. And so if you can think about how to make a cylinder, one way to do it might be to do a cut line just along one side. Or you can do the same thing like a pair of pants and you might have a cut line along both sides. Well, now we have one shape in our arsenal. If we start thinking about adding in another shape, we might want to add in something like a sphere. Spheres can get a little bit grumpy, but if you think about a beach ball, that basically is a way that we can cut up a sphere. We could also cut up a sphere kind of like what a baseball cuts up a sphere as, where we sort of have these two overlapping pieces. Once we have a sphere, we could start combining these. So we could take both of these shapes together and think about how to do a shape kind of like a gumdrop shape. How do we do a shape that is rounded on the top? What is going to be the right shape for that particular piece? And so if you get some of the basic shapes down, cylinders, spheres, thinking of how to combine them, of which there are a lot of different ways to do that depending on how you want that look. And something that's basically understanding how a box comes together. You've got some basic shapes that you can use to combine together in an arsenal. And the best way to do that is with a piece of paper, find a shape that you want to learn how to make. So if we wanted to learn how to make a cylinder, we can get a cylinder shape. We can get a jar or a can or a soda, and you can fold what is a flat sheet of an object, a piece of paper, around that and see how it has to contort and distort to make that shape. So we can see right here, very easily, all I need is one seam, and this piece of paper wraps around it with no distortions, no blips, no errors whatsoever. I know I can do this very basic shape and get what I need for a cylinder. So there's nothing wrong with wrapping around shapes. And because my background, or what I'm enjoying doing right now, is sculpting, this is a really good way for me to wrap my head around shapes and use this as basically a starting point. So when I was doing the Plague Doctor Bird, looking at my sketches, it's kind of this cone that curves up at the top. And so I got one of the plastic cups that I use in my resin casting process. I found a shape that was closest to the proportions I want, and I took a piece of paper and I wrapped it around that cone. And you can see as soon as we start becoming more of this tapered shape, our shape gets much more complicated. We have this whole sort of pushing and pulling going on. It's narrower at the top. The bottom is no longer even with itself. It's become distorted. It's got a lot of twisting going on. So what we want to do is try to make this lay as flat as possible with none of this extra guff. So I drew a line with Sharpie that holding up to the sun, I could see that line is. I traced over on that line with a sheet of paper, and then I cut up that shape. Oops, things are falling off the table. And then I cut up that shape, and here is my first draft of the bird pattern. So knowing to do a cone shape, I actually have to have a curve. And you can see where I taped those first wraparounds together and I actually cut a straight line on a clean side. So I wasn't trying to deal with what were the original two edges of the paper. But this shape forms a cone and stays completely flat. And all I did was use this as a guide, drew Sharpie lines I could see through it, taped it together. Get yourself a thing of basic old marking tape, masking tape, get yourself a Sharpie, get yourself a pencil or two. I actually prefer having 3 colored pencils on me at all time. Even when I'm sketching art, I use a red pen, a blue pen, and a regular graphite ink. I generally prefer mechanical pencils because the point's always sharp, but sometimes a less sharp point, a duller point of a regular pencil is good too. Get yourself some scissors, and if you have it, get yourself a box cutter or an X-Acto. Please be very careful. Even if you feel you know what you're doing with a box cutter and X-Acto, they can still wound you. This makes your life easier, but you can do this all with scissors if you want. But I just taped around the cup until I had that core shape. And for the plague doctor, that core shape was the body. Once I had that core shape, I started trying to figure out what I was doing with the head. And you may not really be able to see it on video here because this could be a little too blown out. But I have cuts I've made and then I've taped back together. I have things that I've drawn over. I have all of these things going on. I'm a copious note taker. I'm constantly taking notes to myself, both on the surfaces I'm working on, but also on other sheets of paper. We can see even here on the further put together plague bird, I have notes written to myself, especially if you're going to stop for the night, make yourself notes of what you're doing. But the great thing about paper is I can tape it back together if it was the wrong cut. The head wasn't folding the way I wanted it to. I started folding the head a little bit like the top of a beach ball, and that was just making too many points, so I moved a little bit more to like this baseball type shape. Again, just shapes I've observed from out there in the world. And I just play with it. And when this is too ragged or I'm not getting the information I need out of it, I put it on a fresh sheet of paper. I trace around it. At this point, I go through and try to clean up some of my lines. I make sure my edges are actually straight. I fold the paper in half so that I can make sure I have some symmetry going on within that. And I have another go. And this is Plague Bird round 2. When I started feeling better with the main core of the body, this is when I start putting on other mock-up pieces. A piece of paper to see the form of the nose, the blip on top, the tail, a wing, because all of those, drawing on the eye, because all of those would change the way that you see this. My next stage of this, which I unfortunately haven't been able to work on in a few days because I am not feeling well at all. I've got a migraine. But maybe after this, I'll manage to work on it a little bit. I'm also not my most eloquent today because of that. I apologize. I would be taking all of this apart. I'd use my X-Acto to cut out all of my seams. I'd make sure all of the notes I have are on here. And I would then trace this over and make my changes. Sometimes I'm going to cut this apart for those changes for me to see. Like I might cut off the separate pieces. Other times I may just translate those through. And I'm going to go through another paper iteration. The thing about plushie making is it's not about, you can't be afraid of making mistakes. Plushie making is a series, and most art is a series of making continual and constant mistakes that you are always learning from. And as you're learning from those mistakes, you're making changes and improvement to your pieces until you're ready to start that final version. Another example of this would be the llama doll, who I still have to go and glue the heads on, but talking about that sort of perfectionism, I'm wary to do that last step, especially while so much is going on in the world and in my head. That is not the llama. But let me walk you through just real quickly that, if I can find the llama. And see, so with the llama, I was doing a shape I couldn't find very easily in real life. So I made a little clay llama. And if you've been with me for a while, you saw this. I have the little ears in that too. And this was exploring my forms and my shapes from a very crude 2-second sketch into the 3D. What I did with this piece of clay then, and this is a never dry clay, so it's still mushy and gooey, was I wrapped it in masking tape. And from that masking tape, I wrapped it up, and just like I talked about with the bird, I drew over it, I drew shapes on it. I tried to think, using knowledge I did have for making shapes like cylinders and curves, how I would need to break that apart. And I cut apart the masking tape based on the shapes I thought I would need. Some of them I did have to go back in and re-edit after they were cut apart because my goal is to try to get them to lay as flat as possible on a sheet of paper. I stuck all of these to a sheet of paper. I went in and scanned it. I have a really cheap printer scanner. I went in and scanned it, and then I blew it up to what I thought would be a good size and cleaned it up. So I went and did my symmetry work with a symmetry tool on. I did this one on the computer because I knew this was a pattern I wanted to be able to reproduce consistently. I trimmed it up. I printed it out. I realized it was far too big. I went in and printed it out a little bit smaller. Here you can see my original traces of all of those masking tape pieces with, again, constant notes on there. But I went and I printed it out. So I got all of my pattern pieces printed out. And then what I did, knowing this wasn't going to be perfect, so instead of looking at it like messing up, I went in and made a test. So I cut out all of those pieces. All of these pieces were sewn together. So I had the actual plushie assembled in this form. And I looked at what was right and wrong. So you can see these drawovers, the black line being my original trace. You can see my drawovers in brown of what needed to change. I'm drawing myself arrows. I'm marking what's the good side. I'm doing all of these little adjustments that I would repin or re-sew on the plushie. Some of them I didn't sew and just said, well, I know this needs to be here. This is going to be my guesses of what's right. And I did this in a really cheap muslin-like fabric that I just had sitting around spare, knowing that if I wasted it, it's okay. This is fabric that I probably maybe even didn't buy myself, and maybe something I got as a hand-me-down, and it was okay for me to waste it. Old bed sheets. If you're worried about messing up and you've got a pair of old bed sheets that you replaced and you haven't got rid of the old ones yet, it's now good fabric for working up your mock-ups in. But you can see all of this little scribbling and note-taking. Well, maybe you can see all of this little scribbling and note-taking to myself about the changes I needed to make. So I went through, made those changes, scanned all of these shapes, put all of the shapes in the computer, look at how they overlined the changes for my original shapes, printed them out again, and I got the same thing for another round. There are all of my printed shapes. Here are the next round of patterns that I sewed. You can see the next round of edits and adjustments drawn on there. Within that, I also have, and there should be more of these somewhere, but they might be running around with the plushies themselves. Notes that I took to myself. I took order of operation notes of what I was doing. I took notes about the changes I've made. So I knew what were the changes I liked or not. I actually had this stuck to my sewing machine so I could just easily make notes as I went through. I'm a constant note taker and got it all put together into the second go. After the second go, if I'm remembering correctly, I decided that was basically where I was happy enough that I was willing to go forward with that second go, that I felt like that was going to be sufficient to give me what I needed, and I was able to go forward with that. I kept all of my old patterns, and I still actually have them hanging over on a cork board so that if I needed them while I was sewing, I could go through and look at them and take notes, or take a look at my notes and see the edits that I've changed and that I've made. And again, I don't have any of the final babies assembled because the last step of gluing in the resin pieces is a little intimidating. But if I toss or pretend to toss this guy together real quickly, this is where I've got into some research paralysis. Ooh, there are pokey pins. So he's not going to be together for real. He's a little mussed from traveling when I was trying to get them desperately done for the convention and didn't. We can see that this is my final piece. So it has, you know, the bean shape I want. It has the curves I want. Things were still changing as I was sewing this very first one. There were some little shifts and tiny things that I learned, mostly about the order of operation of sewing some things. There were some things I learned, especially about the ears and the top of the head as I was really combining it now with the final resin piece. But I was able to translate it all the way from that little clay sculpture out to the, let's take off its magnet, out to what I feel is the final llama. And now if I can go in and do the last little bits when I feel stable enough, my hands have been a little on the shaky side, I can go in and get the last bit of this done on all three of them. And so it's really a process of letting yourself make mistakes and remembering that it's okay to just try and it's okay to mess up and waste material. I actually, a few people have commented on these. I'll try to take a better picture of it. But I actually have some notes to myself on my back wall that is along that route, that it's okay to simply try. It's okay to spend money just to be wrong. I'm a frugal person because of my background and my parents' backgrounds. Neither of my parents came from money in the least. And so I think within that and farmer stock on my mom's side, so, the depression thing. So I come from a frugal background and I can be really bad about spending money on something just to learn and to be wrong. And it's okay to mess up and it's okay to waste material. And if you're afraid of that, find the cheapest version of it possible. Find that really cheap linen or muslin or cotton fabric. Find a bed sheet that has been, left to the dust rag pile that's never going to be used again, and cut that up and let yourself do iterations. Iterations are so incredibly important to me because it's a way for me to think through what I'm going on and to make those notes and make that process. I spend a lot of time just staring at things and thinking and then making a change and doing the next part of the process. And at the end of the day, it's really incredibly powerful to me personally to see something that started out as a tiny little scribble on the edge of a page. Trying to see if I can find the llama shroom. Not the llama shroom. That's a totally different thing I also need to finish, but that's a resin casting issue. Not finding it right now. A little scribble on the corner of a page that became this whole piece of art come to life in the 3D that I can hold and touch. And for me, that's a very powerful thing. And that's why I go through the process of winging it and, in a way, sort of beating myself, my head against a wall. Even more pages and notes from the llama. Beating my head against the wall just to make that happen and make that come out. Because for me, that's where the real power of it lies. But that said, please, 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 I don't want anyone to think that there is any shame whatsoever in starting from somebody else's work, from somebody else's pattern. And if you don't feel like jumping into the deep end yet, go and buy yourself a pattern or something that you think is cute, that you would like to have. And even with that pattern, start out with cheap material if you want to, and then make it in your final material. But have fun with that. And even if your goal is to make your own plushies, that's a really great place to start because you can see how that maker puts these basic shapes together to make something much more complex. You can see how the cylinder is the leg and the cube is the foot and the body is a gumdrop and the head is a sphere or whatever that specific maker is doing. And by exploring a few different makers' processes and things like that, you can find your own process from that. I also have linked to a free one, Peaches the Mouse. Back when somebody was asking me about art things that I would recommend for them to do while they have time on their hands, you can start with something free. There's other free patterns out there. That's just one I know because it made its rounds very notably on Tumblr, I guess a year or two back or whatever it is now. But just start making and give yourself permission to make mistakes, which is a very hard thing, I know, because I am very bad about that myself. But if you think about the mistakes not as mistakes, but as part of the process, it really makes it a lot easier and a lot more palatable. And you can find the joy in that process, in the making. And maybe like me, it will end up becoming one of your actual favorite parts of the process. So if anybody does go off and make anything with this, I'd love for you to tag me so I could see. I love seeing what people make. I love engaging in what people make. It's why I am an instructor. So if you do make something, let me know. I'd love to see what you make. And if you guys like these sort of rambly explanation videos, maybe at the end of May, when the semester wraps up, we could do a few more of these if it's of an interest to people. Just let me know.